Welcome back to the Ed Morrissey Show podcast. Joining us is AJ Kaufman, who is now the managing editor of the Tri-Cities Business Journal, fellow managing editor, AJ Kaufman. Welcome back.
Good to be here, Ed. It's been a while, and looking forward to catching up.
Yeah, well, I'm looking forward to catching up. It's some grave days out here, man. I mean, you and I have been writing about what's been happening in the world and what's been happening in America in regard to, just rampant anti-Semitism and all sorts of different things. Talk about what's going on in the war. You also have a couple of essays up, one over at lidblog.com, the other one over at Israel National News, also known as Arut Shava, contrasting peaceful rallies versus violent rallies and talking about the influence that TikTok is having on America, especially in this wave of really mainstreamed anti-Semitism now. I mean, I don't think you can describe it any other way. This is no longer on the fringe. This is on the streets, and it's mainstreamed and on the left.
Mainstream, yeah. We can discuss my articles. We can discuss what happened over the weekend, last night, what's been happening for the past 24, 30, 50, 58, 59 days since the unprovoked pogrom, Holocaust, terror attack by Hamas on innocent Israelis, Jews, and others. I would refer people, by the way, Mike Gallagher, congressman from Wisconsin, has done a great job on TikTok in China. He's leading that committee on that. And it's one thing to have China running this network, but to have them influencing propaganda, anti-American, anti-Semitic propaganda for so long, China's never been a friend of Israel. They've long encouraged anti-Semitism with their state-run media. They've said that Jews control the economy and foreign policy. In any event, my articles at LidBlog, Gallagher's done some good work on that. He's been on podcast, and that's really unfortunate. And that's why we see so many people under 25, under 30. It may even be under 40 by this point. People born after 1980 who are anti-Israel. Ordinary, normal, middle-class people that might live next door to you, not just people around the globe, or people that are activists. So that is a problem. That information being put out there. And as far as the rallies go, it's hard to call them rallies after what we've seen lately. They are riots. Some of them are riots. Many of them are, violent. The juxtaposition or analogy or comparison I made was the 300,000 people that stood in from all walks of life in solidarity with Israel in Washington, D.C. on the 14th of November, about 3 weeks ago. It was peaceful. It was bipartisan, which you don't see very often.
True.
As far as I know, there was no damage, no security issues. They spoke about peace, and they asked to have their hostages returned. And, some of them have come back, and now we're at unfortunately, a pause in the hostage releasing, not a pause in the war. But these people came together in a different way than you see at the pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas riots around the country and the globe, which so often involve calls for genocide, assaults of people and police officers, harassing of holiday shoppers that we saw over Thanksgiving and again last weekend, desecration of property, and just, more recently, just calling for a globalization of the intifada. And that's where I'll leave my long-winded opening statement out, because I've written about it and you wrote about it this morning. And what we saw just about 12 hours ago in Philadelphia was, an explicit effort to target a Jewish-owned, not an Israeli-owned, but a Jewish-owned business, although he had Israeli roots, in Philadelphia. It was a rally of intimidation. It was not a protest.
In the city of brotherly love, by the way.
Brotherly hate, I believe we're not calling it, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's what was that? Philophobia, maybe is what we should call it.
I don't know how to spell that.
Yeah. I am only making that as an ironic observation on this happening in Philadelphia, because it's not just Philadelphia. I mean, the problem with this is that if it was just Philadelphia, we'd say, well, what the hell's wrong with Philadelphia? But it's not. And I would argue that this is beyond TikTok, that this is something that academia has been fomenting for decades, through the, absurd narratives of supposed decolonization and hatred of the West,
Yes.
that this is something that has been going on for a very long time, well before TikTok came on the scene. And that's the reason why we started seeing it erupt first at college campuses and in towns where you had, these Ivy League institutions. Columbia University. I don't know if you saw this. I think Chris Cuomo actually is the person who put this out. Highlighted this poster of a rally at Columbia University. Right, this is New York City, Columbia University. It's one of the, I believe it's considered an Ivy League school.
It is. It is absolutely.
And it's also a big journalism school. Not coincidentally, I would argue.
Not at all coincidentally.
Not at all coincidentally. Where you have a rally and it's about supporting the Palestinian counteroffensive of October 7th. Counteroffensive.
What do they count? Never mind.
No, I mean this is sort of my point, right? Is that they have adopted Hamas and the Palestinians as decolonizers on the left, even though the Jews were the original inhabitants of this land, right? And have been there continuously over thousands of years. And
I believe they were there 2,023 years ago when a certain person that we're going to celebrate in 3 weeks was born. Right?
I saw that.
I'm Jewish, but I know that.
Yeah, we're celebrating the birth of a Jew in Nazareth 2,023 years ago. But yes, the Jews only showed up in Palestine in 1947. I saw somebody tweet that out, and I really did.
Simple concept that is like lost on people. Was he the only Jew? Maybe he was the only Jew there. Maybe he was the only.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and they are arguing that Jesus was a Palestinian. It's like, no,
he
was a
refugee.
Yeah. He was a refugee, yes, because they fled into
Palestinian refugee.
I will grant that, but he was a Hebrew.
Picked out by the settler colonialist Jews.
Right, exactly. I mean, this is all sorts of absurd. You can only get this stupid in academia.
I would say you can only get this stupid. I hate to say it this way. You can only get this stupid in Ivy League and elite academia, because I think if you walked over to your local college campus or mine, we both live in semi-rural areas. I know you're not going to find it. I've been on the campuses during my work for the Business Journal all around this region in Appalachia. Not happening. Not one protest against Israel, but as far as I can know, between Nashville and Washington, D.C. That's like an 800-mile radius of East Tennessee, Southwest Virginia. Not happening. It's only happening in Boston, New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, LA, San Francisco, and so on and so forth at the elite college level.
Well, I mean, it's not just at the elite college level. I mean, UCLA, they had a mark, and this was early.
Elite to some degree. UCLA, Berkeley,
it's a state-run college,
right? I mean, top 50 type schools. You're not going to have it at the average community college or local Christian school. That's what I mean.
No, and I don't know how safe that actually is, but it certainly seems to be a lot safer for Jewish students than the Ivy Leagues are. I mean, and this is part of the thing that I was arguing today, is that we can talk about how stupid academia is until the cows come home, and it's true across a whole wide range of things. But this is different. This is not just stupidity; it's hatred, and it's hatred in action. Yes. Because the point of all of this, and this is the reason why I don't normally like to draw parallels to the Nazis, because it's usually that's when the argument
you did this morning, Ed.
Did though, and I didn't. There's a reason why. Kristallnacht was part of an effort to drive Jews out of public life. And what we saw in Philadelphia and what we've been seeing on college campuses where they're chasing down Jewish students or attacking Jewish students is exactly the same thing. It may not be to the same degree, and it may not have the same state-based support that it had in 1933 and 1938 in Germany, but it's the same thing, and the state-based authorities are not doing anything at all to prevent it or to punish people for it.
Was there any police presence last night in Philadelphia when they were harassing this owner of an excellent Middle Eastern restaurant who was of Jewish descent? I mean, they were just basically, the guy, as far as I remember, he had a statement after October 7th where he basically said, it's not an attack on just Israel, but all Jewish people. Hamas is an enemy of, and he listed like LGBTQ, atheists, people of color, anyone who's not part of their extremist ideology. And then
Right.
all he said was that he denounced Hamas, not the Palestinians. He denounced Hamas and said he supports Israel. And yet, this guy running a restaurant who's just denouncing Hamas is now hated and targeted in a Kristallnacht-esque fashion by these protesters. I can't keep calling them protesters, but hooligans, whatever, who are
Mobs.
objectively pro-Hamas. They are
Yep.
not. They never criticize Hamas. They
They're
criticize the falafel-making guy in Philadelphia, who's a war criminal in their mind, apparently, but not Hamas.
for making falafel. Yeah. I mean,
Right.
you have, I mean, in New York City, right? And this, I mean, this is part of the stuff that I wrote about today. New York City, you had people marching saying that they're demanding an intifada revolution. Well, the intifada was the targeting of Jews by terrorists,
Oh, yes. It's
right? I
they're,
mean,
they're calling for a jihad
terrorism.
against Jewish civilians. The intifada is what it is. I mean, it's not a protest anymore. They're looking for ways to destroy Judaism in Israel and anything that stands in their way. It's happened all across the world: Toronto, London, New York City, Sydney, wherever. Far broader than just Israel.
Yeah, absolutely. Far broader than just Israel. And I mean, this is, it is, again, it's a mainstream sort of thing. And it's being mainstream because the authorities aren't doing any, the authorities, right. The academic institutions aren't doing anything to correct against it, or even to really push back against it. And the authorities in the streets aren't doing anything, in the civic sense. The civic authorities aren't doing anything to protect guys like the owner of Goldie's and the restaurant from a mob attack, which is exactly what it was. And look, I mean, even if they didn't break any glass, how anxious do you think people are going to be to go over to Goldie's for lunch?
Right.
Worry that they're going to get caught up in the next one of these things. And that's part of what the intent here is it's to intimidate
Correct.
people, and it's to drive people out of business, to drive Jews out of public life.
Right.
And
And that's where the analogy comes into play, like
yeah,
you said.
exactly. I mean, I'm very mindful of Godwin's law when I'm arguing things. That
Uh-huh.
usually if you've equated something to the Nazis, you've probably lost the argument.
Well, but you're right though about the cities. I think it's important to know that this would not happen for many reasons in Mountain City, Tennessee, or San Angelo, Texas, or Casper, Wyoming. Now, Philadelphia apparently does not. They stand against all sorts of hate you always hear, but not against this kind of harassment and hate. Again, I don't think anyone was arrested yet again. There was no discernible police evidence in the videos I saw. There was no one keeping the mob back from the restaurant or making sure whatever customers were there or employees had ingress and egress. So these people that were at this event last night, again, I use the wrong words, event, at this mob rally, they hate Jews. And they're looking for an excuse to be bullies and bullies Jews out of public life. And do not let anyone tell you they were chanting for peace or anything but an intifada, which, as you noted, is a violent uprising, and specifically a violent uprising of opposition by the Palestinians against Israel and Israelis. So that's what was happening Sunday night in Philadelphia and at University of Pennsylvania, not far away from where this restaurant was, by the way.
Right.
Two different ones.
I mean, if you want to have a pro-Hamas rally and do it the way that the March for Israel was conducted, I have no problem with that. I mean, I certainly have a problem with the message, and I think you're an idiot if you're pro-Hamas, or worse than an idiot.
I mean, it's a Klan rally, basically. At this point, by the way, these rallies are, I mean, everyone hates the Klan, apparently. Is this different than a Klan rally of intimidation with people wearing masks and lighting things on fire?
Yeah, tell me what's different between this and Charlottesville, except for the lack of tiki torches, because it's the same damn thing.
No, right. And that brings us to Joe Biden somehow, because didn't Joe Biden launch his campaign on Charlottesville?
Yes.
And so I'm thinking, and I denounced Charlottesville. I said there were bad people, and I think Trump was wrong. There weren't good people on both sides. There were bad people on both sides. You had Antifa against the Klanman Nazi type. So there were bad people on both sides. But anyway, Biden, and I thought of this morning, and I read something about it too. Biden is from Scranton. I believe we've been told that a few times. I think he's been to Philadelphia 11 times in his presidency, or 10. 11 will be this week or next week, I read. He thinks of himself as an honorary Philadelphian. He talks about himself, being culturally Jewish. He said something along the lines of, "You might say I was raised in a synagogue in my state," he said, at a Rosh Hashanah dinner earlier this year. Well, here we have Philadelphia Jews, his fellow, Philadelphians, his fellow Jews, let's just say. They experienced something pretty frightening last night, on top of what's been going on for the past 2 months around the country and around the world. And you might think that Uncle Joe, whether he was asleep or not, might have had someone there on his Twitter account or Instagram or whatever that would mention that they condemn what happened in Philadelphia. I just, it's amazing. He might be angry about it. He might hold a press conference. I don't like doing whataboutism, but what about if this were the opposite? I'm not going to say what I mean by that, but what if this were an attack on a different kind of business by a different kind of people in
Right.
Philadelphia?
Yeah. It would be a nuclear meltdown in the media over it.
They would have flown Kamala back from Dubai. I mean,
And Josh Shapiro, I'll give Josh Shapiro credit, the governor of Pennsylvania. I'll give him credit for saying something last night about this and making it clear what the nature of this was. But where was he? I mean, I get that he doesn't have authority over Philadelphia's city police, but he certainly could have had the state police involved in that. I'm not sure what the structure is for Pennsylvania State Police, but I know they got one. And I know that they're around that area and they could have been sent in there. Did he even call Mayor Jim Kenney and asked to have some sort of response? I mean, I don't know the answer to that question. I haven't heard that there was
Jim Kenney may have rejected it. Jim Kenney's pretty bad, as far as I remember reading.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he's the mayor of Philadelphia. I mean, how good can it get, actually?
He's down there in the Brandon Johnson levels.
Oh, is it that bad? Okay, well, then there you go. But, it's one thing to tweet out that this is awful. But when you're the governor of the state in which it's happening, there's, you have some.
He's also Jewish, Ed.
He is.
Yeah, I mean, that's double reason, I would think.
And he's actually a pretty smart guy.
He is.
We talked about Josh Shapiro a little bit in the last election, or I think it was maybe just after the last election. And I said, there were 4 candidates at the top of the Pennsylvania state ballot, and only one of them was worth a damn. And it was the Democrat. It was Josh Shapiro. And I mean, I don't agree with his policies. Probably don't agree with. I probably don't agree with a lot of his policies, but he's a smart guy. He was AG for a while and did a good job as AG.
Hey, real quick, because you're talking about Pennsylvania, I'm a fair person. I have to say, you mentioned those 4 people. John Fetterman has been great on Israel.
I mean, I'm glad you.
That's all I'll say.
He actually has been a stud on this.
Yeah, I mean, he's been out there supporting them and pushing back against the far left anti-Israel people. So again, we probably disagree with John Fetterman on 94% of the issues, but because I believe we should be fair, John Fetterman has been up there at the top of the list when it comes to this last 2 months.
And I'm glad you brought it up, because I mean, this is a guy who got elected because he was supposedly salt of the earth in Pennsylvania, right? And he was up against, a snake oil salesman and ended up winning pretty easily in the last election. And he's a progressive. I mean, he's not a moderate Democrat. He beat a moderate Democrat to the nomination right as he was unfortunately having a stroke. And I can't think of the guy who was a former congressman who was the moderate in that.
McCormick.
No,
I'm sorry. Connor Lamb.
Yeah. He beat a moderate by emphasizing his progressive credentials, right? And it worked. So I was surprised. I mean, I honestly thought we'd be hearing a lot of, well, there's good people on both sides type of crap, which you're hearing from like Bernie Sanders and the rest. But he hasn't been. And I still think Pennsylvania would be better off with a Republican senator. I think that they would have been better off with a senator who hasn't had a stroke. But I got to give Fetterman credit that at least he sticks to his guns, and there isn't any equivocating when it comes to his principles. And that's not a common thing in politics, and it is good to see. And it should be at least noted when it takes place. So you're absolutely right. But to get back to this, I mean, I was drawing a parallel to this and the riots of 2020 and, the autonomous zones. What we're seeing here is really a breakdown of civil order that has been long coming. It didn't just start on October 7th. What's happening, though, is that it keeps escalating and it's not getting a response. And that, to me, is very, very dangerous. It's going to incentivize other groups to do the same, including some that might be in opposition to what's going on here. And you're going to end up with battles in the streets if we don't start imposing civic order again and the rule of law. And that's what I'm concerned about, is that we're gonna start drawing even more parallels to 1930s Germany, or maybe even Weimar Germany, previous to 1933. It may get very ugly here.
Yeah. I mean, these are all in, there might be an exception or two. I mean, the mayor of Miami or Dallas, I think, is a Republican, but generally speaking, these are all solely Democrat-run cities. I mean, Brandon Johnson can blame right-wing extremists for whatever he wants, but people in Chicago hasn't elected a Republican in generations. And in reality, you have left on left in some ways. I mean, look at Chuck Schumer's speech last week, which I thought was mostly good. There were some weird parallels he made because he's Chuck Schumer, but he seemed genuinely surprised, I think naively, but genuinely surprised at the fact that his left-wing allies, who marched with him at the anti-Trump and the pro-abortion and the anti-war and pro-BLM rallies over the years, are now turning on him and are turning on Israel and turning on, I guess, what I'd call the not moderate Democrats. I think when it comes to Democrats and support for Israel, and I'm thinking of writing my next column on this, the dividing line is age. It really is age. Take away Bernie Sanders and a few others. Democrats over about age 50, and this reflected in the polls. And I know you're a data guy, and I don't have them in front of me, but I've read them and I'm tabulating them for an article. The polls show that most Democrats do support Israel if the Democrats are over 50 or 55. And if they're under 50 and certainly under 40 or 35, they don't. And that is coming back to education, academia, TikTok, whatever it might be. And people in the streets that you see, just judging by what I've seen, I saw a few in person when I was up in the Northeast back in late October. But in general, people you see in the streets are not over 50. There's a few old hippies at NYU and things like that. But generally, they're under 50, under 35 probably. And there's the dividing line. And that's why they're spray painting the White House with Genocide Joe. I mean, this is amazing that Joe Biden, who's so worried about the Arab vote or the anti-Israel vote, he's not going to appease these people. They're part of a cult. We've talked about cults before. Yep. They're not good people, obviously. But Joe Biden is anti-Israel if you ask someone on the right, and he's too pro-Israel if you ask someone on the left. So it's interesting, and it's not good for the country. And I'd also just say that, and this is related to it, there's a turning point, I think, over the weekend. I know we overrate these turning points, but I feel like the masks, and we talked about the masks being on because they literally were on, but they're also coming off. I think these riots, these urban riots, really now are openly supporting Hamas. There's no cover now. You're either with Israel or you're with Hamas. The ceasefire gambit was a naive distraction, propaganda, really. That's over with now. So Bernie and Chris Murphy and Dick Durbin and many House members cannot hide behind, we want a ceasefire or a pause. Now we're back to war, and you pick a side. And I'd call it good versus evil. I think that'd be accurate.
Well, yeah, if the Biden administration would get around to picking a side. The problem is that they're not. They're trying to pussyfoot around.
If you ask the anti-Israel crowd, they think Biden's the biggest Zionist of all time.
Well, that's because they're idiots. They want, and I think Kamala Harris wants Biden to say, okay, we're just going to cut Israel loose. We're not going to supply them with material. We're not going to defend them in the UN unless they're willing to withdraw and allow Hamas to regroup and reform. That's what they want. That's what the progressive left wants. And it's interesting too, because that would entail having to come to grips with certain contradictions. And did you see the Dana Bash interview of Pramila Jayapal?
Oh yes, it was just wonderful. Pramila Jayapal is everything that's rosy and flowery and wonderful about America and Seattle. Oh yes. I'm inviting her over for Hanukkah dinner later this week.
Oh, there you go.
Fun person to be around, I'm sure.
She'd be great at a Seder.
Go ahead. Tell me. I mean, yes, I saw it, but for our viewers and listeners, yes.
For our viewers, and they've probably seen this because we've covered it. Karen wrote about it today at Hot Air, and Dana Bash, was grilling Jayapal on the fact that Hamas has basically gone on this rampage of rape. Barak Ravid, while we've been talking here, and again, we recorded this at Monday about midday. Barak Ravid, now at Axios, is reporting that the State Department is now, or his sources at the State Department are now telling him that the reason why Hamas didn't want to release the other female hostages is because they would have talked about what the treatment that they're getting, which tells me that they may not live very much longer if they're even still alive. Um, I guess it wasn't a source. It was actually the spokesman, Matthew Miller, said that publicly. And you're starting to hear some of the stories of what happened in captivity to the female hostages. And it's one of the reasons why the Israelis were insistent that they get the females out first. But I mean, this is, we've been hearing nothing from the left except about violence against women and how that's awful and the patriarchy and blah, 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 blah. And here you've got a patriarchy. I mean, very clearly a patriarchy telling their terrorist operatives to go out and rape on an industrial scale to humiliate the enemy, because that's the way that they conceive it in their own religious cult. And all these people are, well, Jayapal's like, well, okay, yeah, well, rape
both sides.
Both sides. Rape happens, war, and Danabash goes, the IDF isn't raping women. Well, but it's
so here's the question. Here's the question, and this has been going on since 9/11. There are books written in 2002, Unholy Alliance, about the secular left and the radical right-wing religious zealots of Islamism. The question is it intersectionality? Is it purely intersectionality? That's why gay groups who would live freely and prosper in Israel and would be, for the most part, beheaded and not allowed to live in most of these Arab countries, especially Gaza, Iran, and wherever. Why are they allied together? Is it the intersectionality, the oppressor versus oppressed? Is it racial? And of course it is in some ways. I mean, Pramila Jayapal believed Christine Blasey Ford, obviously, as did every other Democrat in America. And yet she and plenty of other congresswomen, pseudo-feminists, do not believe, or at least are skeptical or ignore what Israeli women or just the media is telling us about what Hamas does to women, what they do to everybody. So it's unbelievably hypocritical, but it's not even a strong enough word.
Just to emphasize the point. Now, this is not an original thought to me. I saw this on Twitter and I thought it was a pretty good point to make, is that they didn't use Blasey Ford as the, oh no, I take it back. They did, because it was, I know who it was now. It was Mark Judge that made this argument on Twitter today. He said, Christine Blasey Ford said that, she'd been assaulted at some party at some unknown date, and some unknown circumstances that she couldn't recall, but she was sure that Brett Kavanaugh was the guy who did it, et cetera. And everybody was like, well, you have to believe her because that's her, she's testifying to it. So you have to believe her. You have a picture at the same time, you have pictures of women being hauled off by Hamas whose trousers are soaked in blood, which is clearly some sort of sexual assault extremely violent sexual assault had taken place. It was, well, you can't judge that. You don't know what the circumstances of that were. Maybe they just sat on some blood. It's like, you got to be freaking kidding.
It's political. Oh, it's political. I mean, Blasey Ford, they had a woman there who was going to potentially stop a somewhat conservative Supreme Court justice nominated by Donald Trump. And in this case, you have Hamas, which is not a left-wing organization, Hamas, but they are supported by the Western left, and Israel, which is not a right-wing country, in my opinion. It's a very liberal country in many ways, supported by almost every Republican around and a decent amount of Democrats. Almost every Republican except for Thomas Massie. And I don't even want to get into that.
Yeah, let's skip the Thomas Massie thing. I'm just going to finish up on this thought. And I do want to get your reaction to this, because you were saying, what this is about. I'll tell you why this is happening is because the American left, I'm not talking about liberals. I'm like Dennis Prager. I distinguish between liberals and the American left. Now, I don't agree with quite a few liberal positions, but liberals have an ethos, right? And it's about focusing on improving society. I don't necessarily share their viewpoints on that, but they're, it's separate from what we're seeing from progressive left. The progressive left isn't interested in justice in the usual sense. What they're interested in is destroying Western civilization. They hate Western civilization. They hate that they're part of Western civilization. They want it dismantled because they want it replaced with the socialist utopia to follow. And so there's no contradiction for them. Queers for Palestine is not a contradiction.
Right. It's just the word progressive is obfuscated, because there's nothing progressive unless you're talking about progress toward tyranny or progress toward socialism. That's why I would say just the left. I would just call it the left. And classical liberalism, I have no problem with it, because classical liberalism supports Israel, supports free markets, supports democracy, things of that nature, which you and I and most Republicans support.
Well, and it's also based on, Western values.
Yes.
And this is part of the reason why I say that this problem existed long before TikTok, AJ, is that the universities in this country and in other Western countries have been trying to dismantle Western civilization for decades. They stopped teaching it. They stopped teaching classical education, which informed people of the values of Western civilization, as well as, the things that it got wrong. They just want it destroyed, and that's their mission. It is an indoctrination into a anti-Western cult, and except for maybe STEM and a few of the other professions, that's what universities do these days.
That's where I believe the "hey hey ho ho Western Civ has got to go" expression originated, I believe, at the university in the, someone can correct me, 60s or 70s. It wasn't as late as the 80s. I know they was chanted by Jesse Jackson and some people, but regardless, that's where it began. That was the genesis of it, and that's backs up your point.
And this is the result. This is the result. And it's, yeah, AJ, we got to let it go at that. But it's always great talking with you. Why don't you remind people where they can find your work, all the different places they can find your work. And again, congratulations on your gig as managing editor of the Tri-Cities Business Journal. That's pretty awesome.
Thanks, Ed. The Tri-Cities Business Journal is Northeast Tennessee and Southwest Virginia, and the website is bjournal.com. B as in Bravo, journal.com, and that's my baby right now. I'm running it pretty much on my own, you could almost say, with a few other people helping me out. And then, of course, lidblog.com. Every week, usually Wednesday or Thursday, is the column. Israel National News picks up most of them, especially if they're dealing with foreign policy and Israel, and they are usually posting them within 24 hours of when they go up on lidblog.
Well, there you go. That's where you can find AJ. AJ, great talking to you again. We'll do this again sometime soon.
Thank you, Ed. Yep.